Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Young Screenwriters Podcast. I'm Alexie, and I'm here today with Adam. And today we are looking at The Seven Basic Plots by Christopher Booker. So, this is a monster of a screenwriting or screenwriting storytelling book. And it gets into this idea that there are only so many stories that actually exist in the world. With a caveat. We'll get into the caveat later. There are only so many different kinds of stories that exist in the world, and most stories are derivatives of the seven basic plots. And so we thought that that idea was interesting, and we wanted to check out the book and look at what we loved, what we don't love, so that you don't have to. Because, like I said, this guy is a monster. Like, it is 736 pages. That is a paperweight and a half. And I think that this is going to be an interesting time.
Yeah, I'll say first thing that I took away from this was the power of how this kind of can connect to genre, right? Like it's a very you can think of oh, I'm going to tell a western or oh, I'm going to tell a tragedy or I'm going to do a comedy, and sometimes when you're just thinking of traditional screenwriting frameworks, you can get locked into kind of some arbitrary definitions of things like, oh, I have to, what's my normal world for this character? Or like, what's my, inciting incident, right? You can think about terms in like the patterning of every other screenplay book or the screenplays you've written before. And sometimes looking at these kind of frameworks, like these different plots that we're going to get into, it can be a way of like recontextualizing, oh, what's the story I'm trying to tell in a different way. And I think that's kind of the power of these frameworks and the power of the hero's journey in general.
No, totally. I agree. And I'll say one of the things that I found most interesting was just, although I don't necessarily agree with it, I love that he did try to focus on psychology as like a big source of why he believes what he believes about story. Um, he's very Jungian. That's how you say it, right? Jungian.
Yeah.
And so
It sure doesn't mean he's young.
nope.
Sorry, that was terrible. Shoot me.
Oh my god. Yeah, no. But so, he's very Jungian, so he believes that's like the whole like id, ego, alter ego guy. And so that plays a huge role in his theory. And obviously now a lot of Jungian stuff is discredited and is not what we believe is actually going on.
but
But
it's still a lot of fun.
it is a lot of fun.
From a
It is.
writer's point of view, it's fun. The same way personality tests are a fun way to think about characters and, like an Enneagram for your protagonist. That's a fun exercise. You can get something out of it. It doesn't mean it's real, but it's
No,
fun.
yeah. It is fun. And I like that. Like when I'm thinking about storytelling, I always get very excited when I can understand why something is rewarding or interesting from a psychological perspective. Or like when I better understand the way that people change so that I can put that into a story. Those are the kinds of things that really, really interest me. So that was the thing that interests me about it. And it's also part of our caveat that we wanted to kind of lead with before we get into the details, which is that, this book is what, like 20 years old now? I don't remember how old it is. I think it's 20 years old now. Yeah, it was from 2004. And so it has some outdated stuff in it. It's very Jungian. And also, the author is a controversial dude, a little bit of a climate change denier.
So
Got
we're
some
not
of
glorifying him by saying,
no.
"Oh, he's amazing." The book's got some interesting ideas, but
Yeah,
not that we're going to cover.
we definitely want to touch on that and say we are, in this case, we're looking at the plots because when I was looking for a book to explore the idea of like these core plots, because you hear that all the time, this is the book that constantly came up, and so we decided to give it a shot. So
So,
yeah.
I'll start off by saying sort of his worldview based on Jungian psychology, he has this basic conceit that, there are 7 different plots that are sort of patterned throughout mythologies and throughout our history and all of our modern stories as well. And I think if you look at all of the examples, he makes a pretty compelling case that many stories share the qualities of his framework. And not just that, the motivations inside of the beats line up. They make sense and they're useful from a writer's point of view to a certain extent. He believes that kind of all stories have sort of these archetypal family dramas like play out. Whether or not it's an overcoming the monster story or a rags to riches story, there's this sense of you've got a character who has some sort of form of selfishness as they relate to their family and the people in their life. And through going through the story, he uses the term, an ego-centered selfishness, right? That becomes more of a communal sort of value that they share with their family. So archetypal family dramas play out in all 7 of these different varieties according to his worldview. And I think there's a case for that. But then again, human beings, we all have families, right? So it's a shared experience of like
Yeah.
everyone has uh, parents or chosen family or, brothers and sisters in their life. And the stories that we have sort of accumulated throughout our human existence share the basic patterning of human family dynamics.
And just to make sure that we're very clear, does not mean that every story is about a family, literally, right? This kind of
Oh,
reminds
yes.
me of a type of therapy that I'm very fond of called internal family systems, which people immediately tend to think like, oh, that must be about family specifically. Like it must be like a type of family therapy. No, it's actually like an approach to therapy that's very similar to Inside Out. It's kind of like different parts of yourself and stuff like that. I'd say in a way it kind of plays with the Jungian ideas and brings them into a more modern understanding. So
Yes.
it's family in
To
that way.
And just to
Yeah.
define Jungian ideas, so there was a psychologist, Carl Jung, who existed in the early 19th century, who was a colleague and pupil of Sigmund Freud, and expanded on some of his ideas in a way that he was talking about myths and archetypes of being like the father, the mentor, the all these terms that we see in Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey are sourced from the writings of Freud and Carl Jung, mostly Carl Jung. And in that kind of ethos, they believed that every consciousness, every mind was made up of 3 different components: the id, which is kind of your base like desires that you're almost unconsciously wanting, that you're hungry, you want
Yeah,
something,
your
you have
animalistic
lust.
side.
Yes,
Yeah.
your animalistic needs that come out, right? Whether that's selfishness or greed or whatever. Your ego, which is the consciousness that you're consciously aware of, the
Mhm.
things that you're aware of, basically. And then the superego, which is your highest self, the part of you that sacrifices for others, the part of you that contributes beyond yourself in society and your world. And that every human being is made up of the id, ego, and superego. In my high school psychology class, it was described as a house where you got you're on the ground floor, your ego, and in the basement is a kid who's like yelling up at you all the time, the id, and in the attic is the superego, who's your grandpa giving you advice. That was what my high school teacher used, and I kind of like that.
It
So that's kind of
works.
a consciousness. That was the framework. Now, this has been disproven. Uh, this is not an accurate model of human consciousness, but it's kind of how archetypes are patterned in this sort of worldview.
Mhm.
Let's get into the book.
Yeah, let's do it. So,
Alexie.
yeah, something that we can start with is this idea that okay, so when I wanted to talk about this book, my initial thought was I remembered this video that Kurt Vonnegut did where he was talking about the shape of story. And he was like, stories have different shapes, blah, blah, blah. Like some go up, some go down. The traditional like arc of story and how some of them vary. And I was like, okay, cool. We can go here and we can map out the shape of these different plots and compare them. Well, then when you get into it, you realize that they actually all share a shape in this theory. And that kind of connects to his idea of the basic meta plot. So this is his like overall structure. This would be his um like kind of like his tentpole document, so to speak. And he has a 5-act approach to story. He calls them stages, though. And so there's 5 different stages, and you can line them up with a 3-act structure to help you understand them better. So the first one is the anticipation stage. This would be your act 1. This is when you're getting that call to adventure. You're getting that promise of what's to come. Your inciting incident would be here. You would meet your characters. He also calls it the call, right? So this is the anticipation stage. The call is in here. Then we move into Act 2. So this, or for him, it's called this dream stage, right? So this is early Act 2 into more traditional 3-act structure. And this is where you are going off into a new world and you have some initial success. He calls it a dream stage because at this stage, it's almost like you have this brief moment of invincibility. You step out of your comfort zone and you're starting to see some things work out for you. You're like, oh, maybe this will actually be okay. Like maybe I actually have a plan for this. Um, then we hit this point, which is the third stage, which I believe, and I think Adam, you believe this too, lines up with the midpoint of a traditional 3-act. So this is the frustration stage. So now you're getting frustrated. You're confronting the enemy, and things are starting to go wrong. And he also calls this the confrontation. And then we move into stage 4, the nightmare stage. This would be post midpoint Act 2, so Act 2B basically. And this nightmare stage is the point of maximum dramatic tension, disaster all around. We're in the final ordeal. It's really focusing on that ultimate test. He's kind of focusing on specific moments like that. So this is the ultimate test when it seems like everything is ruined and you eventually get down. It kind of actually feeds a little bit into the beginning of Act 3 because you hit that all is lost point in this nightmare stage. And then his final 5th stage is the resolution. This is where the hero, heroine, whoever is victorious. They may get united with somebody that they love. It's the moment where everything comes together. This is the resolution, the final act. So Booker's idea here is that all these 7 plots fall into these 5 different stages that you can kind of lay on top of 3-act structure. It's just a different way of looking at 3-act structure. And when he gets into his variations, he kind of just gives more detail about what specifically is happening in each of these stages. So that's kind of the overall summary. That's the meta plot. And as you can see, like as I mentioned before, it has a very definitive shape. You have the anticipation, which is kind of flat, the dream where everything's kind of going up, frustration where it gets hard, nightmare where everything gets bad, and then resolution where you get happy again. So it all has the same shape, but the way that it plays out is different. And Adam, you had a really interesting idea about how that connects to genre. I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but
I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I think these 7 plots are all connected to genre, right? And let's just list them really quickly. Like there's, and this first of all, the meta plot you just described is the components of every one of these storylines, right? So like there's an anticipation stage from almost all of these, but he makes like a slight tweak for one version versus another, right? Like it has characteristics specific to the plot. So basically all he's done is divide these 7 plots into 5-act beats, with the exception of comedy, which he makes into 3 acts for some reason. But
because
anyway,
it's a joke.
So the first one is overcoming the monster, which you could classically put into the vast majority of horror stories, or stories of like the heroes have to overcome the beast that's attacking the village, right? Beowulf is one of the versions that he cites in the book.
On Star Wars: A New Hope. Surprised you didn't say
yes.
that one.
Yeah. Which is interesting because I think the reason why he used that is the Death Star. And it's very much like there's a monster encroaching, which is more if you make the empire the monster of that story, chasing the hero, and the hero has to overcome it. But I don't know if that's more of actually a quest, in my opinion, because I disagree with him. I think the first Star Wars is a quest because they're trying to take the droids to the rebel base, right? And in the meantime, they get caught. Anyway, so there's the overcoming the monster. And then there's the rags to riches story. the rags to riches story is really, I think it's kind of, there aren't as many examples of this nowadays, but it's in classic literature. You have like the David Copperfield, you've got Les Mis, you've got Cinderella, Aladdin, Jane Eyre, all of these stories where we meet a character who's participating in society, but they're like the bottom of society, whether they're like the street urchin in Aladdin
Would
or
this be
Cinderella.
Good Will Hunting, maybe?
Yes, that's a right. I don't know. Does he have riches at the end?
He has like emotional riches, you know?
But I think that's more of a rebirth.
That could be. Yeah.
But I think it's very much stories where somebody at the lowest class of society rises above their station to a higher class of society. That's
Mhm.
kind of, I think, you know, and in the Kurt Vonnegut Shapes video, he, you know, draws a sort of the Cinderella story. And I think that very much lines up with that. But it's stories like, you know, I think of Victorian novels. There's so many of them where you meet a character who's a lot of Jane Austen novels feel this way, right? Like there's the family that needs money and she needs to marry into a better family, right? Or, you know, some sort of character who's an outsider becomes an insider and also has an emotional change.
Do you think that, so just, I know that kind of aside from the plot and stuff, do you think that these stories aren't as popular anymore, like the rags to riches stories in particular? Do you think it was something like of that time, or do you think it's
No,
transformed?
I think it's
Or
just I think people still love the idea of it. I mean, I think Forrest Gump might be a rags to riches story.
that's true.
Although that's also kind of a quest. And you'll find out, I think a lot of modern examples layer these stories, right? Like
Mhm.
I almost think of these, I'm getting off topic a little bit, but I almost think of these as like powerful human psychological motivators, right? Like if you look at all these plots, there's something powerful that we relate to, right? We can all visualize a monster, and overcoming a monster is powerful. We can all visualize a tragedy, right? We can all visualize like these are deeply patterned emotional moments that we can sort of hang ourselves into. But I think there are some stories that contain multiple characteristics of these, especially long stories. But I'm going to continue. So we have overcoming the monster, rags to riches, and then we have the quest. And I think the quest is the one that most commonly is associated with the hero's journey, right? You have a character
Mhm.
like the Odyssey, Watership Down, Lord of the Rings, you know, you have a quest. Frodo, you got to destroy this ring. We have to go someplace to get rid of it, right? The King Arthur or the Arthurian legends or Sir Gawain, the Green Knight. You have to go find the Green Knight. You've got to go get the Holy Grail. You have to, you know, leave to get something or leave to accomplish something. And Watership Down, you know, it's like we need to leave to find a better home, right? There's a deep sort of, it's a journey plus a concrete objective.
Is it Dune 2? Would Dune 2 fit into this? Where he's kind of questing for, he was almost like
Well,
questing for nukes, not quite nukes, but
I
you know
think
what I
that's
mean? Like,
I think that's, if I really had to think about it, I think that feels like a rebirth because he himself transforms into something else, like his internal transformation. I mean, there are a few things going on, right? Like
yeah,
there's a, you know, a political drama that's, you could sort of say is a, it's a riches to rags story in some ways, right? But then he becomes emperor of the universe. Yeah, the quest is, you could define it as a quest, but also, you know, according to Joseph Campbell, every story is a quest, right?
that's true. That's true.
So it depends on how abstract you want to get, right? Pulp Fiction's a quest, technically, right? Or you know, Bruce Willis wants to, you know, gain, you know, get out of the city with the money. You know, that's a quest. You could say that, but then
Yeah,
some people might say like,
objectives. Yeah,
yeah, it's whatever an objective is. That's the quest of the movie, right? So I
that's
think
true.
this is kind of a catch-all plot. But it's very powerful and old. Like Theseus, like, you know, you've got to go get the golden fleece, right? It's very much like you have to accomplish something. I think that's kind of how I would distill a quest. Like the
Mm,
hero has a need to accomplish something, and there's no options. They have to do it. Um,
that makes
that makes
sense.
sense.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
Yeah. The next one I think relates in some ways. It's so I'm just to recap. We're doing, this is going to be like what's it called, the
What's that
12 Days
game?
of Christmas, 12
Oh,
Days
yeah.
of Christmas, and the Overcoming the Monster, Rags to Riches, The Quest, and then voyage and return.
Mhm.
There and back again, right? Like, and I actually think there are many quest stories that are the voyage and return, right? Like,
Yeah.
the difference he uses is he very much sees it as kind of something almost involuntary, right? Like Alice in Wonderland, you fall into the other world. Wizard of Oz, Dorothy falls into Oz, right? It's not like I want to go accomplish the thing. It's I have set out on a voyage and I want to return home, right? Like the desire to return to where you were. It's almost the inversion of the quest, right? You the whether or not somebody, like he lists the time machine by H.G. Wells as like a famous example. Obviously, the protagonist of the time machine wanted to travel into the future, but the idea is that he gets stuck there and he's trying to get back.
I'll give you a modern one.
Yeah, give me a modern one.
Inside Out. Because they
Yes.
fall all out of Riley's little brain control center, and now they have to try to get back.
I love it. That's it.
Yeah.
That is and they have to literally travel. They have to travel to the subconscious, and Bing Bong has to save them. Yeah.
God, Bing Bong. R.I.P.
Toy Story. Actually, Toy Story is a voyage and return.
That's true.
Yeah,
they got to get back to Andy.
that's right. So, and I also think Lord of the Rings is a quest and a voyage and return. So this is kind of where I think you can, like, because on one hand, like literally the Bilbo's book in Lord of the Rings is there and back again, right? To go and come back. Both stories, a character leaves and returns changed, right? But they are on a quest, right? In The Hobbit, he's to go to the mountain and reclaim the dwarf's home. In Lord of the Rings, it's to destroy the ring. So that these are kind of, I think, two sides of the same coin. You have the quest and then the voyage back. The interesting thing about it is that involuntary aspect of the voyage, right? I think Alice in Wonderland, she didn't want to go to Wonderland. That's the interesting part of that for me.
It definitely shades the way that the protagonist is going to approach the challenge, right? Like, are they? Because you can still have a reluctant hero in a quest, but they still ultimately, in a lot of cases, have to choose to be there. Whereas in these other situations, they're just kind of thrown in the voyage and return. They're just tossed in, and now they have to deal with it.
Right. And just to sort of come back to the framework, the meta plot that we've gone over, he makes slight adjustments to this. Like he changes the language of in Overcoming the Monster. Instead of resolution, he just says miraculous escape. But all the other beats are the same, right? There's still the anticipation, dream, frustration, nightmare. But it's a miraculous escape instead of a resolution.
And the
right?
death of the monster is what happens at that fifth act.
Right. The monster has to die, right? So going back all again, we got Overcoming the Monster, Rags to Riches, The Quest, Voyage and Return, and Comedy. And this is the only of the only beat, or sorry, the only structure that has 3 beats instead of 5, 3 stages, I should say. He sort of starts with Under the Shadow, which is kind of a situation where there's a lot of confusion and disconnection between groups of people, right? And I think confusion and disconnection are kind of the interesting words there. Like, you have a group of people who are not at community with each other, and the confusion gets worse.
Yeah.
And,
think in The Hangover, right?
That's right. That is actually that's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Right? It's a drunken night out, and then where's the groom? Oh my God. And he's
why is there a
3
tiger?
Beats,
yeah.
That's right. The 3 beats are Under the Shadow, Tightening the Knot, and Resolution. So under the shadow, there's confusion and disconnection. Tightening the knot, confusion worsens into a nightmarish tangle. That's the words he uses. And then finally, the resolution, where the problems are solved and there's a joyous union and clarity out of the confusion. I can think of a lot of comedies that do share this sort of descriptive language.
It's an interesting way to look at it, because like my first reaction was like comedy. Like initially, I had a nope, that doesn't make sense reaction to the fact that comedy was its own thing, because I felt like things are comedic, but they belong in other story structures. But I kind of like the way that he approached this in the end. Like I do think that it kind of like it should be layered on top of something else. I don't think that this is enough to build your whole story, because there's not really any plot given in here. It's more like what is the emotional state of people and like what's the overall vibe of what's happening more than like what's the plot happening. So you kind of need to
Right.
layer comedy on top of Voyage and Return or on top of something else. But
And
I like
and I
it.
do think, just to add, he's very much drawing the term comedy from the Greek and, Shakespearean.
He called
The
Jane
modes of it.
Austen a comedy.
Well, it is technically. She's a comedic. I mean, have you read any of those? They're
I
funny.
guess not. I have
They're
a
very
hard
funny.
time.
She's a funny writer. She's like her,
All
and I
right.
will say to because I'm very pro Jane Austen. She was one of she invented the limited third point of view. Like
Oh, good. Thank God.
she invented like I'm just going to give you a direct thought from this person without any without any pomp and
What a
circumstance.
champion.
Yeah, she's a great and important writer, but also her. I mean, also comedy is contextual. Like
Yeah,
people
true.
think, you know, if you were German in the early 19th century, Kafka was probably funny, right? So like there's,
True.
time changes everything. But so Much Ado About Nothing, Midsummer Night's Dream, Importance of Being Earnest. Those are kind of the archetypical comedies that he was drawing on, where you have a group of people who fall into confusion. Like all the Shakespearean stories are like, and they have mistaken identities. He was really his love interest the whole time, and he was gender swapped
It's funny to see what was
confusion.
funny in different times. Like, I guess part of me is kind of like, wow, they'd really never seen anything funny in their whole lives. So anything at all was funny. And I get
That's
jealous.
so not true. Okay. People had lives, and it's just
Uh, you
also
know,
Shakespeare is a
yeah.
lot funnier when you see it well done than when you
No,
read
it
it.
yeah.
I will
It
I will say
is.
that.
It is. That's true.
There's a
But
lot of fart jokes, which is my thing. So and then the
quote
last
'em.
two, I'll be very fast, are tragedy
Mhm,
and rebirth.
mhm.
Tragedy is kind of interesting in the sense of it's about, a character who is consumed by that selfish id. Like their ego related problem destroys them, right? Like if you look at Macbeth, like his desire to be king consumes him into kind of the resolution becomes like a fulfillment of a death wish. That's kind of an interesting idea that I like about this, is sort of like, because you hear about like the patterning of like, tragedy where the character suffers from their fatal flaw, but like there's this sense of like they have that flaw, their archetypical ego problem is what kind of becomes a death wish for themselves. I liked
Yeah.
that language.
The death with wish stage. So Thelma and Louise would be this.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely, that's a great example.
and yeah, I mean, is Whiplash a tragedy? I know it's an anti-hero story. I guess it is kind of a tragedy in a way, or he doesn't have a death
Comedy.
wish, but he like kill. Oh yeah, totally. It's hilarious. Uh, he like kills part of himself when he decides to.
I think that's an overcoming the monster.
Is the monster himself?
Fletcher is the monster.
But he doesn't really overcome him so much as
Yeah, he
like give
does.
in to him.
I think
I
I
guess
mean,
he
he beats him on
surpasses him. Yeah, right.
I don't
Like,
know. This is kind of, you can get into
no, I think it's
definitions.
interesting though. I
Yeah.
think that that's kind of what's fun about this is trying to see like, okay, what does this mean now?
Yeah.
Um, and then
But
Rebirth.
and Great Gatsby is,
Oh yeah,
and Othello, Macbeth, Anna Karenina. Those are the examples of tragedies that he sourced. But the final one is actually one of my favorite stories. It's the Rebirth. You know, you have a character who, like, their anticipation phase is very much similar to the anticipation phase of the tragedy, in the sense of you have a character who has a deep ego problem, who has a sort of deep fatal flaw that defines their life in a very fundamental way. But instead of fulfilling the death wish in the tragedy, they have a miraculous redemption. A great example is Christmas Carol. One of my favorite and very cliche stories. Scrooge is the ultimate miserly individual. They experience a journey that forces them to rebirth themselves and to redeem and to transform from that flaw to, of a selfish, non-community friendly value to a selfless community value.
yeah. The one thing here that's kind of annoying is that if the person who's being redeemed is a heroine, then they're redeemed by the hero, and if it's a hero being redeemed, then a young woman or a child will redeem them in this theory. So,
I mean, in
I
Christmas
just
Carol,
really,
it's Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim redeems.
little child, there he
And if
is.
Scrooge was a woman, she'd need a boyfriend.
Yeah, she'd need a man. I
That's right.
really need to keep looking around to find the man who's going to redeem me. Is my takeaway.
I think Flight is a redemption, is a rebirth story.
That's true.
That's one of John's favorite. It's like this character who's deeply struggling with alcoholism.
Yeah.
Has to overcome that, and the whole appeal of the story is to see emotional transformation. Anyway,
do you want to do the rundown? Yeah, do it.
Yeah.
Do your song.
On the first day of Christmas. No, overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, rebirth.
Yep. And all these fit into that initial basic meta plot, which was 5-act: anticipation stage, dream stage, frustration stage, nightmare stage, and resolution. And if your initial reaction to this, like me, is, okay, well, all of these end with some kind of resolution, like all these seem to be kind of positive except for tragedy, you are in luck, because he has anticipated this and has talked about the dark version of each of them, because he would not be a Jungian without
Tell us about the dark inversion.
Yeah, so he has this idea, like kind of like a theory that he talks about a little bit, which is a concept, which is called like the complete happy ending. And so in the regular versions of these 7 meta plots, the ego-centered stuff becomes more like alter ego, I guess. Look, I'm not a Jungian, but like basically you become more fulfilled and you achieve your goal, you have resolution, and all the characters are redeemed, and you become, let's see, it says if all that is ego-centered becomes centered instead on the self. Yeah. So basically, if everything that is kind of like your ego becomes centered on self, then everybody is redeemed and you have a complete happy ending. And that's kind of the basic state of his different 7 meta plots minus tragedy. Now, there is a dark version where the ending is generally tragic and disastrous. It's following the same structure of that meta plot, but essentially you have a bad ending. The person does not transform in the way that you would otherwise anticipate. So every single one of these plots, the overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage, return, comedy, and rebirth, there is a dark version where you don't become a better person in the end, where you fail your mission and you have like a tragedy version. So I thought that was fun. We gotta have the dark side, and I appreciate that. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility. So what I've found about this book is that he says the 7 basic plots, but then he starts giving us some more alterations. So like when you include the dark versions, it becomes 13 because tragedy was already dark. And then he also includes a couple, like 2 other types of new plots: the rebellion against the one and the mystery. So he includes 2 other ones. So he's like, oh, there's 7, but they can also be dark. But also there's 2 more. And these are outside of the guidelines. And also there might be more. So it's kind of fun that there's not really 7. The title is a little bit misleading, that there's only 7 stories.
1000%. He wanted a sexy little number.
Yeah, because it's not as cool to say the 13 plus basic plots
or the
and
7
more
plots and variations.
Yeah, the 7 plots and all their variations, plus a couple other new ones that I came up with to account for Agatha Christie.
Yeah, because he doesn't really account for mysteries at all.
No. Well, so
that should be an 8th one, honestly.
Yeah, so that's what part of his like new plot section. It's that he presents these 2 additional plots that are outside the basic 7. And this is kind of to say that the existence of these meta plots and this overall structure is not meant to say that there's no other options. And he says that the mystery starts by posing a riddle, some kind of baffling crime has been committed, and now the central figure has to unravel it. So that is like Agatha Christie, it's probably Sherlock Holmes. It's a lot of those classic procedural TV shows where you have crimes. Um, and yeah, so that's one of his things that don't fit.
Let's call it an eighth plot, solving the riddle. I love that.
Solving the riddle. There we go. We
Because
fixed your
honestly,
book
that
for you,
is a
Christopher.
story. That is a story. Like Sherlock Holmes, he's not having these emotions. He's not having a rebirth.
No,
like
he
he's
doesn't
not
care.
Sometimes he's overcoming a monster, sure, but like it's very much like it's the mystery. It's the riddle in and of itself. The desire to have the mystery solved is outside of the character's interest because the audience wants the mystery solved, and the detective character is just like a externalized proxy for the audience to be like, huh, who did kill the butler? You know, and you finding that out, it's like a different emotional experience than, oh God, what's going to happen to little Timmy?
Yeah.
You're reading to be like, how did little Timmy die? That's a very different emotional experience, Was it
And
the butler? Was it
who
the
did it?
maid?
Yeah.
It
Turns out it
was
was
the
all of them, right?
It was all of them. They all killed little Timmy. See, but that like if you were reading a rebirth narrative about little Timmy, you could do a different story for all of these, but I think the mystery is an eighth plot that's mystery. I like that. Solving the riddle. He should call it that.
And then he has this one that I'm just like, damn. Like this other exception that he has is called Rebellion Against the One. And tell me how depressing this is. So basically, there's this hero, right? Hero or heroine. And there's some power in their world that has like complete control over everything. And at the beginning, they're very disenchanted by this. They're like, I don't like the government, right? So they feel like they're right. They feel like the government is bad and this mysterious power is at fault. They believe that. So like our hero is like, oh my God, the shadow government is running everything and it's horrible. But then as they kind of move through their journey, they're confronted with this power. They see the shadow government and they understand its awesome omnipotence and like how powerful it is, right? And then the rebellious hero is like, oh man, I guess I was wrong. I guess I didn't understand the full picture. And they're sad. And then they accept that the shadow government should really be ruling.
They should call this one "The House Always Wins."
Yeah, they should. That's a much better name because Rebellion
Yeah.
Against the One. But how depressing is that? He cited the book of Job. I always say Job.
Job.
Brave New World, 1984. So just like
The dystopian world, all of those stories, except I haven't read 1984 in a while, but from what I remember, it's sort of like you have this horrifying worldview to the reader, right?
Yeah.
Be the winner, right? Like you have like in Brave New World, there's the whole world has like been genetically modified and everyone is birthed, right? And there's one, and they all have like different classes, like laborers are all genetically modified to have a certain intelligence of 80, an IQ of 80, versus like the higher classes get to have full intelligence. It's really horrible. And there's no such thing as art. It's all pornography. And that's all that exists. And the main character is Mr. Savage, whose complete worldview is the complete works of Shakespeare. And he was actually born traditionally outside of society. So he's kind of the viewpoint of all this horrible world. And he's like, don't you care about art? Don't you care about meaning? And they're like, what's that? You want to watch some pornography with us?
As we do. Yeah.
Yeah, and at the end he kills himself and succumbs to their worldview, and it's very much like, well, the house won. Or 1984, it's the last line of the book is, "I love Big Brother." It's very much like the character is totally crushed. Like you have the trailblazer audience proxy character who believes in a better world is crushed by the terrible world order.
So before I mentioned Dune 2 has some aspects of this, right? Like where Timothée Chalamet
Oh,
is
definitely. Yeah, you're right.
yeah,
You're right.
where he's like resisting this. You know the words of this better. He's resisting the church, and like he's like, I'm not going to go that way. I'm never going to like I'm not going to go south because or whatever direction he's not supposed to go because bad things will happen. And then in the end, Benny Gesserit, that's a word that's relevant. He ends up drinking the worm juice and giving into it and seeing all these different things, and now he understands the power and like the whole opinion of this church that he thought was kind of evil. He starts feeling himself as the chosen one and is like, yeah, you know what, this is the way to do it. Screw everyone, let's blow up all the spice. That's my really in-depth summary of Dune 2.
I like
uh
that version. It's fun. Um, I
so
think, yeah, I think there's an aspect to this where there's sort of like he was rebellious. He had like kind of
Mhm.
he was rebelling against his destiny. He had this idea that of like morals, you could call it, this ethical qualms with the vision that's being thrust upon him, and he ultimately has a conversion experience where he is goes along with kind of that vision for himself. I think it's a little more complicated in the sense of like the Bene Gesserit don't want him to do that, right?
Right,
It's
yeah.
kind of like this other external idea, but I think there's this idea of, you have this world order win.
Yep.
The macro view of society wins out. The unethical macro view of society wins out against the righteous minority view, which is a very true to life and upsetting. I think all dystopian novels kind of might share characteristics with this.
Yeah, this is called The House Always Wins, and it's called Making Reality Easier to Swallow by
That's that's or accepting that you love Big Brother. But so I'm
Yeah,
just going to go over through all of these again.
do it.
Overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return,
Mhm,
comedy,
mhm,
tragedy,
mm.
rebirth, solving the riddle, and the house always wins. So 9 plots. We will one up you. This is not actually nine's kind of a more fun
Why
number.
wouldn't he go with 9? Like, if he had these, like, why was 7 so important? I bet it was a Jungian thing. Does Jung really like 7? Like
I don't know. I don't know. Seven's a special number.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of one of the interesting applications I took from like revisiting this concept, one of the interesting applications I took was if you think of these as certain subjective to a protagonist, right?
Mhm,
Or a character, like, oh, this character is undergoing a tragedy, or this character is living out of rags to riches. You could possibly layer these. And I don't know why I thought of it because I'm not the biggest fan of Les Mis in general, but Les Mis has like several of these stories play out. There's a rebirth, there's a tragedy, there's a
mhm.
rags to riches story, and there's a quest technically, right? There are a lot of characters and they're all having very different emotional experiences to each other. And part of the reason why that story is very emotional for many people, some would say melodramatic. um,
Some, not you, but some.
so some would say melodramatic, not me. I'm okay with Les Mis. You got all of these really emotionally heartfelt. If one character is having a tragedy and like being overcome by their self, their own evil, one character is having a rebirth, and one character is having a rags to riches story, right? Like those kind of the cascading of those emotional effects can be quite moving and interesting. Um, I'm not saying do that unless you have 3.5 hours. Um, because that took us a lot of bandwidth to do, and I think
Yeah.
the average movie really only has enough bandwidth for one of these
Yeah, 1 or
to do very
2
well.
maybe, right?
Maybe,
Like
yeah.
stealing pieces from a few different ones. But yeah.
But layering this is kind of interesting, and I also think that these are all tied to genre on some capacity, right?
Yeah.
Like the cliche horror story, not cliche, but the standard horror story has a monster of some kind, whether that's a psychological monster or a actual physical monster. There is a monster to overcome. Um, and what if there's a rags to riches story mixed in there? That's kind of interesting. I don't
Yeah.
know.
I think that the thing that for me is the most interesting about this, and it's kind of a variation of what you said, or like the most helpful about this, is I think that when we're creating our own stories, a lot of times we have this moment like where we're like, no, my story is bigger than anything that's ever come before it. It is so much more complicated. I can't possibly distill it to this one thing. This is a person with 3 dimensions. They have a lot of depth and relationships, and they want so many things. And it can be helpful to try to let that part of yourself chill out a little bit and figure out, like, okay, but what is the basic structure at its core? By identifying a basic structure like Rags to Riches or The Quest or Voyage and Return, you're not diminishing the complexity and the depth that you're putting on top of it. You're just giving yourself a foundation to kind of understand the direction that your story is going to go, the shape of the story, and to like help give yourself some anchor points for what has worked emotionally time and time again. That does not mean that like you can't do twists on it, that you can't subvert expectations in different ways. You can always do the dark version, you know, you, you know, yeah, look up some Jungian archetypes and toss some of those in there. But at the end of the day, it's like it can be helpful to force yourself to find the simple version of your story to make sure that you understand it at all its different levels. Because when somebody can only tell their story as like a long rambling paragraph or page, that's the stage where you don't yet understand what the core of your story is. That's why we always push people to say, okay, like what's your log line? Like what is your log line? Distill your story into 1 or 2 sentences and tell us what it's about. And this is kind of part of that, right? Like this could help you get to that log line. It's like your story could fit in something like this, some variation of this, I think is a good guess. Most stories you could say, well, it's kind of Rags to Riches. You know, like Good Will Hunting is kind of Rags to Riches. You could look at that if you were writing Good Will Hunting and use that to help you decide, okay, what are the kinds of things that I should be hitting in my log line? Like, what's the core part of this story? So that's the use I would say of this, is just remembering that it's not bad to have a simple core of your story. And
In
I
fact,
think,
it's probably a good thing.
yeah, honestly, I think it is a good thing. And you can always see that where when people are like, explain Toy Story in the most annoying way possible, you know, like things like those little trends online are like, explain, I don't know,
That's a
Dune
voyage and
2.
return and a
Yeah,
rebirth, and a
yeah,
rebirth. Because Woody goes on an adventure, but he has an emotional rebirth. Like
there you
he
go.
he goes from being sour, selfish, horrible, know-it-all to being a community leader who is selfless. And he goes from the classic flaw that I always like to bring up is like he goes from I won't share Andy's love with anybody to I'll share Andy's love with you, the person I hated most.
Yeah.
Um,
Pixar's are almost always a rebirth stacked on top of something else. Like that's kind of their
yeah,
deal, right?
yeah, definitely, definitely.
Um, but I think
Finding
that,
Nemo is a quest.
or is it a voyage and return? Because no, no, no. Because well, for
Do they
Nemo, it's a
return?
voyage and return, right? Like
Right. That's right. That's right.
for
And
Merlin, it's a quest to get his son.
Merlin. I think it's Marlin.
Marlin, Merlin. My bad.
Merlin the fish. No, it's okay. I
Yeah,
like that. I like
he's a
Merlin.
wizard now.
That's funny. Yeah, that's right. Um, yeah, I think that's right. And this kind of aligns with kind of the theory I had, which is sort of like a lot of modern stories take two of these things
Yeah,
and track them with different characters. Like, you could have and I also think they can line up pretty easily. Like a voyage and return and a quest are very similar, right? There's a journey. It's just the only difference is really the why of your going. Like Nemo, he's not on a quest. He was stolen away and has to get back.
that's true.
Marlin is I'm going to get the person who was stolen away. So it's a quest in that sense.
That's true. What's interesting about this, about the way that he's chosen to classify these, is that it puts the motivation more front and center than sometimes you see. So it's not just a matter of like, okay, what is the objective? What are they doing? This also helps us tap into the why of what they're doing, which is something that we see a lot. We see people often struggling with giving their character an objective that is not the exact same as their motivation, because motivation can be intangible. You know, motivation can be like, oh, I want to feel fulfilled, or I want to find love. And objective should always be something very tangible and specific. So, like, what does that look like? It looks like dating this particular person, taking this particular person to prom, getting my son back, whatever it is. And if you look at these plots, a way like the way that they've been organized, which is not groundbreaking, but it's just succinct, can help you put the motivation into the story in a more streamlined way.
The most
Um,
interesting of these in terms of variation is the comedy, in my opinion, because it's the only one that doesn't have 5 beats, it has 3 beats instead.
yeah,
And I think it's because he couldn't think of one. Uh, but like there's this interesting idea of it's centered on it's the only one that's centered on community and it's not centered on an individual's experience.
yeah, yeah. It's definitely comedy in like it's comedy in the older definition, like where. But
Well,
I mean,
I think these beats fit a lot of modern,
they
these classic
do.
modern, like Bridesmaids, for example, is
True.
definitely a devolves into it's confused and devolves into more confusion until it resolves into sort of community union. Superbad does the same thing, right? It's like we got to go get alcohol for that party, and it just gets a lot more confused, right? Like I think that's the word. The tension escalates with the characters being growing farther and farther apart, and the confusion getting more and more intense
That's
until there's that
interesting.
moment where that's actually, I think it's the most interesting idea. It's the most unique idea actually I read from these 7 because I've never really heard our comedies articulated that way, and it feels true
That's
in
true. It
many.
makes me want to read more about comedy and like how other people structure comedy. But yeah, that's true. That's probably the most articulate that I've seen about the confusion, uncertainty, frustration. Everything gets worse, and then everyone kind of transforms and comes back.
Like all of the Judd Apatow films from 2000 to 2015, I think you could say follow this pattern.
Yeah, and sometimes I've had people ask us like, what about these, I can't even remember the names of them because they're not my kinds of things, but like what are these like meandering, everybody's like smoking weed comedies? What how do they fit into the structure?
Oh, like the mumblecore, like,
Yeah,
yeah. I think a lot of those stories are rebirth stories,
that's true.
actually, that are kinda witty, right? Like there's a difference between like, "Oh, this is seen as funny," and or "This moment is funny," and "Is it a comedy?" Right? Like,
Yeah,
is it a comedy with a capital C according to, like, the Greeks, right? The comedies weren't necessarily funny, right? It was
yeah.
like anything that wasn't a tragedy. Um
Yeah,
And I think, in terms of this structure, he's talking about kind of the capital C, which can be funny, but it's like kind of the devolution of like, yeah, Napoleon Dynamite. Yeah, I don't think Napoleon Dynamite follows that
the
structure. What is his
confusion thing.
objective? Do you remember what his objective is in that movie?
God,
It's been such a long
all
time.
my immediate thought was tater tots, but that's not correct.
Well, no,
Um,
Pedro is running for president, and
yeah, it's
Napoleon doesn't
that's
have a
the main
rebirth.
thing.
He
It's
doesn't
a
have a change.
mm-mm. That is the main thing though, is that he's trying to help Pedro run for president.
In some ways, it's a
And
tragedy to see all these sad people's lives, um,
but Pedro does become class president. Um,
he does, he gets a win at the
yeah.
end, but it's Napoleon's story. Napoleon doesn't really change, and
Mm-mm.
Napoleon doesn't really I'd have to it's almost I'd have to rewatch it, honestly. That's a good one to do because I love that movie, or I loved it at the time when it came
His
out.
big transformation is that he impresses everyone with his dance moves at the end, remember?
Yeah, he has
Like,
that
that's
movie,
like a big moment.
and that girl kinda likes him, but he kinda seems ambivalent to it all. That's kind of what I mean, like, it doesn't feel like a character arc because he is kind of like, "Yeah, whatever, I don't care anyway."
He's kind of a Paddington too, the world's changing
Oh my
around
god,
him.
you're right. It's a flat arc. He transforms the world. Uh,
Who knew it
I
was
don't
so
know.
deep? Awesome. Well, I
I have
hope
to rewatch that one. That's kinda confusing.
yeah, now we'll do a whole entire episode breaking down Napoleon Dynamite, comparing it to Paddington 2, and figuring out which of these Jungian things it fits into. But yeah, so this was fun. I think that, even though this is not a book I would recommend people pick up because it's too freaking long, I would recommend understanding kind of like what he's talking about. I think that what he's talking about has some value and can help you find the core of your story. And it's just another way of thinking about story and about like the different events that must happen to make a story interesting. Like when you strip it back to its basic foundation, what are the 5 beats, the 5 moments that must happen for a story to be interesting? I think that that's something really compelling that kind of comes out of this book. And then obviously the comedy thing, which is something we kind of realized as we were talking, is yeah, that's a really interesting way to articulate comedy and approach to comedic things. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. If there's any other books you'd like us to read for you, so you don't have to, please let us know. And we would love to check those out. It is always very fun. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you so much, everybody.